one of the challenging things about narcissism, and everyone's using the word, is that they talk about narcissism and they treat it like it's synonymous with psychopathy and the same as sociopathy and blah, blah, blah. Personality researchers struggle with this too, right? These things don't just it's not like there's these distinct cuts between all of these things. So there are researchers out there who are looking at these, maybe even at the nature, not evil is a strong word, but like really bad, cruel, mean, difficult personality styles. And what they found was, originally the theory was called the Dark Triad, and it was made up of narcissism, psychopathy, and something called Machiavellianism, which is really being exploitative and willing to use other people for your own advantage, right? And what the researchers found was that these things hang together. These traits kind of all hang together, and it results in a person who is unempathic, cold, callous, calculating, often superficially very intelligent and charming, willing to make a relationship with someone and then sort of use them and for whatever they need them and then sort of abandon them, right? The researchers then expanded that theory a little further to something called the Dark Tetrad. So they kept the psychopathy, the narcissism, and the Machiavellianism, and they added something called sadism to the mix. So the intentional infliction of harm on someone, and kind of it feels good to harm someone. So it's dark. It's dark. That's why it's called the Dark Tetrad. So when these traits hang together, we see, when we talk about malignant narcissism, it tends to be more of that, like really almost intentionally harmful, revenge-seeking, manipulative and cruel, and yet charming and all that stuff. There's that famous story of Dirty John, and it was an LA Times series. It was when podcasts were just beginning. Everyone was hooked. And it was basically the story of a woman, Deborah Newell, who she was in her 50s. She met a guy, charming, charismatic, handsome, everything she wanted to be. And, she's totally into him, and red flags everywhere. Her kids were adults. Her kids didn't like him, but still they move in together. Within 2 months, it was very clear something terrible about this guy, and manipulative and awful and dangerous. The whole story. And so within 2 months, she was already having to live on the lam. She was having to move every 3 days. She knew how harmful he was. And then the whole story culminates in that he knew that some of her family members were naysaying him. So he was going to try to kill her daughter, Tara, and Tara killed him. Tara in self-defense. But that guy, John Meehan, the man she was in a relationship with, was a perfect example of a dark tetrad. And so it was evil all the way down. And yet charming, charismatic, attractive. She felt special. She felt seen. I mean, enough so that she obviously pulled him into her life. And the challenge with the whole story was there was a real tendency to want to depict Deborah as foolish. But really the story to me was, this is how the manipulativeness, if you didn't know what this was, how easy it was. And back in 2017, that was only 6 years ago. We weren't talking about narcissism the way we are now. I think my first book had already just come out, but it still was sort of a small hoofbeat in this whole conversation. But that's probably one of the more classical examples of a dark tetrad person who we've sort of heard about. And then since then, there have been a lot others have come up in the media. Prisons are full of dark tetrad folks, but a lot of them are out and about. We know that dark triad people are successful business people. They can actually succeed quite brilliantly in the world because they're willing to use people. They're very manipulative. They don't care. They'll make big, risky decisions because they're not afraid. So it's complicated and it is dark. And I hope someday they expand that dark tetrad theory one step further with a dark pentagon, pentad, whatever you call it, and bring paranoia into the mix. Because people who are like that they're very suspicious. They think everyone's out to get them. They feel like there's a target on their back. And that chronic suspiciousness means they're very provocative and reactive. Like, what are you looking at me for? Like, you better watch out. I know you got it in for me. And they're just, and they'll kind of start going at people that way. So I do think paranoia is in that mix too. Right. Yeah, so it's dark. This is some people get into relationships like this. Again, Dirty John was a great example of that. But there's, people will say, when I first met this person, they were charming, they were this, they were that. But the cracks on this will start showing pretty early. And these are relationships we often term as coercively controlling relationships, characterized by fear and menace and isolation and stealing of a person's freedoms. So we see this in domestically violent relationships all the time. Yeah.
Ooh, and so the 4 sides tetrad must be like the hardest. And I mean, like, yeah, what does that actually result to then? The person that has the most epic control?
It's a person who is menacing, isolating, the ultimate control. Absolutely the ultimate control. They have absolutely no care that they're harming somebody else. Even with that level of the dark tetrad, you're not seeing as much of the shame and the insecurity.
Oh,
yeah.
Because so is it psychopathy?
Psychopathy, yeah.
Do they have shame and empathy in them?
No. They can fake it though. I think the dangerous thing with psychopathy is that they know that people want you to be this sort of warm back and forth. Dirty John, he was very charming initially, really seemed like he was listening to her problems and he cared about her. So they know how to put on a show. They are able to figure out what it is people want and give them that thing to draw them close. That's the Machiavellianism.
And then the sadianism, you said?
The sadism.
Yeah, the sadism. How does that result then, if you don't mind breaking that down?
They will say terrible things to people unapologetically. They'll do hurtful things. They will hit them, harm them, steal from them. They'll get off, but they'll also get off on it. Like they'll say something cruel to someone and watch that person get devastated and almost feel gratified by it. They will watch someone fail. Their whole business fall apart or their relationship fall apart, and they'll be like, karma's a bitch kind of thing. Like they'll be it's very dismissive of other people's pain. And one would argue that they may even want to be the one who's creating that pain for another person.
Would serial killers then kind of go under this bucket?
I would say a lot of serial killers probably are dark tetrad, yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that's so freaking fascinating. So now if, let's say, with everything we were speaking about, we really want to come full circle. If you decide that you now actually want to leave this relationship, so you've identified all their tactics that they're trying to, put on you to potentially keep you in that relationship. You're identifying all the gaslighting, like you actually see all the signs. What are the tactics that then a narcissist is going to lean into even more so to actually trap you so that you can potentially change your mind? So I've heard you speak about, like, they're obviously going to do, in the past we've spoken about like smear campaigns and things like that. What have you seen be the thing that just when you think someone's got their foot out, they end up turning around and changing their mind?
Hoovering. So the narcissistic person going back to love bombing square one. Baby, I was so wrong. I can't believe it. I can't believe I'm about to lose you. The best thing that ever happened. I'm going to get therapy. I am going to, you are worth fighting for, right? So they future fake. They say they're going to change. They say they see it all clearly. And what's so upsetting about that, it means that all along, they were hearing what their partner was asking for. They didn't do it, but they weaponize it and use it as a way to suck someone in because they're thinking, well, they heard me. So they must need, that must mean it registered. No, they heard it as something they could weaponize. That's different. So they'll often hoover and really try to draw someone in that way. So that's a big one. And that often will lead people to do an about face, especially if there's stakes in the relationship, kids, shared finances, a history, culture, all of that. Big one. The other thing that can keep people stuck is when, that's the sort of the hoovery part. The other part is the abuse part, where they start literally making this such a miserable experience. It's called post-separation abuse, that the person's too scared to leave. They may threaten them. They may hit them with so many legal, if it's a divorce, so much legal stuff that the person's like, I can't survive this. They'll make threats about custody. They'll make threats about money. They won't pay things they need to pay. The person may not have money for an attorney. And while someone else will say it'll all work its way out, when you're in the middle of it, that working its way out might be 5, 6, 7 years down the road. It's the narcissistic person, like you said, smear campaign. They'll mobilize everyone else. They'll tell other people, terrible things about you. What many people have said at this phase is they like, I just wanted it to stop. And the one way I could have made it stop was if I just went back in and gave them what they wanted, and which was control back, which is they went back into the relationship. So it's just so, again, post-separation abuse, scary, frightening, unsettling, that to leave was just too much. And so they would go in almost to stop the pain.
What do you advise people in that situation?
I would say it depends on how severe it is. Like I said, at the most extreme cases, to work with the domestic violence program, if you are able to get legal resources. And I know here in LA that there are organizations like Peace Over Violence where they have legal resources available. So if you contact them, they have people available to give legal guidance. I can't say that for all. I'm honored to be a part of Peace Over Violence's advisory board, and they've been around for a long time. So these things exist in different places, but sometimes areas that are more rural, and they may not have the same kinds of support. So, like I said, I can only speak to LA where something like that exists, but sometimes domestic violence programs can yield that. Countries like the UK, which are phenomenally ahead of the curve on understanding coercive control, there are a lot of programs in the UK where their domestic violence programs are accounting for coercive control. They often have great professional guidance and people, advocates, attorneys, things like that, who get it there and can guide people through that process. But like I said, it's spotty in terms of where people can get that. And if you're lucky, LA, UK, you might be able to get it. Other regions, not so much, but you may need supports and information. If you're being hoovered back in, that's where therapy can become important. A safe sounding board with a therapist who gets what this looks like. As a therapist, Lisa, I can never say to someone, don't go back, don't go back. But I can really help them say, okay, how are you feeling? And help the client sort of sound it out. And sometimes they come to their own conclusion, like, who am I kidding? And if they do go back in, having a good therapist say, okay, what are we going to learn from this, and walk them through it. So, but again, not everyone can always afford therapy, and I'm aware of that.
And sorry, if you mind me asking, is that because legally you can't tell someone to go back or not to go back?
So as a therapist, my role is not to give advice or guidance. My role is to work with the client to help them understand themselves so they are their own agent of change, right? The last thing I want anyone to do is feel like, I need my therapist. No, you've got the tools. When you walk out here, you came in here with a box with a few tools in it. We're filling it the rest of the way up. We're teaching you how to use them. And the goal for me is that you go. That you at some point would say, I'm good. I've got this now. I get it. But if they feel like I've got it, what is she going to say? What guidance will she give? They're not making it from an autonomous place. I'm a sounding board. I'm a safe space, but I'm not an advice giver. I don't tell people what to do. Yeah.
Should friends then, because and maybe I'm just projecting, but if I was in your head and you just see somebody who's clearly been in an abusive relationship and you've heard all the stories and then they talk about going back, like in my head, I'd be like, I'd want to scream, like, don't go back.
Remember, we're not talking about physical abuse. Like, let's,
right,
boom,
yes.
I'm lifting that out, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's the problem. People in emotionally abusive relationships have been told, sometimes their whole lives, but certainly in this relationship, what to do. The last thing I want therapy is to be one more place where they're being given a command. So by getting to feeling, connecting to a sense of agency, and we use therapy as a place for a mental experiment. Like, let's play this out. Let's play out the scenario of you leaving. Because what will end up happening is because you've got to remember this, Lisa, what people forget about leaving an emotionally abusive relationship is it can be dangerous. Post-separation abuse is real. The stalking, the menacing, the texting, the emailing, the smear campaigns, the guilting, the passive-aggressive, the on and on, like having a damn AirTag put on your car or a tracker put on your car or stuff put on your front door, not knowing there's a camera here or there or that. It's bad. So, any of us who are doing this work clinically, we already know, you got to get a sweep in, you got to get an electronic sweep done of your house, got to get one done of your car. Make sure if you don't have an iPhone, if you don't have an Apple phone, make sure you find out if there's any trackers. Those discs are this big, the biggest quarter. So make sure we really have to make sure there's get their computers over to Geek Squad to get them scanned out, make sure there's no malware. It goes deep. We really have to work with people. So it's terrifying. And some people say, I don't have the stomach for this. So it's not that simple. Are they up for it? Do they have resources? Do they have a safe place to go? Do they have money? And the answer for that for a lot of people is no.
Do you suggest in those situations, especially if it's if there is like I could just only imagine how that would feel, that someone's like coming after you, really trying to put a smear campaign out. You know, you've built this reputation, you're a good person, and this other person who, you know, you've said in the past and you've said multiple times even in this episode, is that they're very charismatic. Like a lot of people do actually really gravitate towards narcissists. So you don't necessarily see all sides of them. In that situation, do you then suggest that people do things incognito, like on the side, like kind of like slowly leave a partner? Like, is that?
That's a good question. So it becomes, you know, it was something we call in psychology successive approximations, right? You're not going to go from I'm in an emotionally abusive relationship to packing boxes just like that. And one thing I've often, you know, suggested to clients, we use therapy as a place to mentally play it out, right? And the second is we do small things. I'm like, whatever you can get documents-wise, I need you to start scanning this stuff. We need to get this on a thumb drive, and we need to get that thumb drive out of the house. Because you're going to need this stuff, and if you can't get it, slowly get a couple of your grandmother's earrings, things that aren't community property, things that clearly, again, you cannot take anything out of that house that is shared. If you're married, shared joint property. So, but a thing like you're thinking, okay, the last thing I want is to be locked out of this house and I can't have my kids' baby shoes or something like that. Put that stuff away someplace carefully if you think you're going to need to be getting out of this. And again, check your devices for stuff too. I mean, with the cloud and all this and people on family accounts, your phone is as good as a tracking device. If you're on a family plan, I promise you that narcissistic person knows where you are all the time. So be careful. So if you go in for a legal consultation to an attorney, they don't see you pulling up to that office in Century City. Leave the phone behind. Give it to a friend, get a burner, do something so you can be in touch with people that day, but that phone isn't following you all over creation. But if it's a shared car, odds are it has a tracker on it too. So it's really about, it's about preparation. It's about being realistic. It's about tiny little steps. For some people, even thinking about the thought of leaving is a big deal. Because I have to tell you, the first time a person says to me, I need to get out of this, I'm like, checkmate. We've got this. Now we get about 55 moves to that checkmate, but now I can see the game, right? And so once they say it, it's not like, great, let's go. I'll say, okay, talk to me. How are you feeling? How are you feeling in your body? And they'll say, my God, I'm panicking. I'm like, we're just talking about it here. So the mental experiment slowly. So they've now vocalized that there could be a future outside of this relationship. Then it's painstaking work, again, somatically connected to their own psychology, their feelings, their thoughts, the practicalities. Listen, Lisa, some people are practical. They're like, I am not sharing custody of these children. And they're like, at the stroke of midnight, when my youngest child turns 18, I'm filing those papers, and they do. And they literally, their kid's 18th birthday, they say to the attorney, pull the trigger, here we go.
And that's because they've done the steps of...
They've done all the other stuff. Yeah.
So actually, if you don't mind taking me through that, so you just said...
Depends on the situation. I mean, it depends on the situation. It's going to be different for everyone. You know, if it's marital situation, it gets a little more tricky. It's going to be different in every state, every province, every country. So there's no uniform kind of piece here. But it's really, I think, more than anything, thinking it through. What would this mean to you? In terms of the other practicalities, it could be if there are documents, you know, that you might need someday if you were to go, copies of passports, things like that, birth certificates, the little glitches that you're like, you do not want, because getting those little pieces of paper, should the two of you no longer live in the same house and it's a partner, could take forever. So little things like that, getting organized, having it all in one place, getting it on a thumb drive, because if they decide to throw your computer on the ground and smash it, that's going to be a problem. So getting it on a thumb drive, getting it out of there, those little kinds of things that can help you feel like, okay, if this really continues to get south, there's a path forward. For me to kind of safely get out of this. It could, you know, and like I said, what I don't want to veer too much into is sort of the domestic violence safety plan here, because that's a very different animal of go bags and safe places to go and cash, and that's a different conversation. So I'm really trying to say in the people are in something that are saying this is becoming untenable, but I'm not ready to go yet. But should I be ready to go? What would I need to know? Those sorts of like little bits and pieces that mean that if the time comes and you're like, I'm out, and you're the one who's going to physically leave, some of that is possible. But I really think the deeper work is in therapy. For what does leaving mean? Some people will say, my parents were divorced, I vowed I'd never get divorced, and here I am. For some people, it would be they have their own abandonment wounds that are thinking like, well, what if the minute I leave, they meet someone new, or they're leaving because they feel like their partner is being sort of inappropriate or shady with someone new. Like, I don't want it to be so easy for him to go with the new person. It's complicated. So having a place to sort of unbraid some of that stuff, but I think mentally playing it out. Like, what would this look like for me? What am I scared of? How would I feel? How would I cope? Becomes, it's sort of something a person plays out over and over again. Worst case models, best case models, all of that. And then it's going to land someplace in the middle, most likely.
Well, that's so powerful there to think about, because I'm such a tactical person when I'm feeling emotional or like I'm feeling helpless is the truth. To have something to go back to that can be almost like a guiding source. Like, I really love that breakdown that you just gave of how do I feel, what would leaving look like, and then coming up with those tactical steps. Did you ever see the movie Sleeping with the Enemy? Oh God, I watched that as a kid and that just haunted me. And just thinking through how she really like had these massive plans behind his back, and then the fear of getting caught as you're having these plans. So how many of your clients, and what do you advise, like as they're processing this, they still haven't made a move yet, obviously not talking about physical abuse, but maybe I want to leave this relationship. How many of them fear talking to you about that honesty or talking to you about leaving because of the fear that maybe their partner finds out? And how many people stop vocalizing maybe to their friends or to the people around them that they're struggling in a relationship because they're so worried about that getting out?
Well, I think it's less so in therapy because they know that it's a confidential space that no one's going to, that no one will know about. But with friends and others, that's a very reasonable fear. And I think that people want to be careful about, even within their own world, especially if it's a relationship they've been in a long time and there's more intricate links of friendships and your partner is friends with them and all this other stuff. You want to be careful about understanding all of that. I think a lot of people are afraid that their plan could be found out. Again, we're not talking about severe domestic abuse, that kind of thing. We're really talking about people who are in emotionally abusive, classically narcissistically abusive situations. One fear people have is that, okay, they're going to figure out what I'm up to, and then they're going to start their hoovering process. They're going to be really nice, and that's just going to make this harder. I've had numerous clients say to me, I just want them to stay terrible for a really long time, so this will feel easier. Yeah.
And that's part of the fear of saying
the fear
anything.
of maybe I'm wrong. The big fear people have is like, especially if it's been a long time, maybe I'm wrong. Some people are afraid of dating, Lisa. They're saying, okay, this is the devil I know. Do I really want to put myself out there? And I say, you know what? Someplace between being in this relationship and a new person is this whole beautiful world called you being on your own and figuring out who you are. And that I think it's people, already going into the, how am I going to meet someone new? I'm like, that's not even on the radar right now. Where, if indeed you're going to leave this is about you getting back to who you really are subjectively. Who are you? And taking ownership of that. And then and only then. And I always, I tell 12 months. 12 months off if you've been to one of these relationships. Nothing. No kiss, no sex, no flirt, no dating app, no date, no nothing. I met the perfect person. They'll be there in 9 months. If they're not, then they weren't the perfect person. No.
That's what I was going to ask. How many people need to process, like, why do they fear being alone, and that being with somebody who's toxic is actually better than being alone?
Well, I don't think people have always processed that fear of being alone. And it's complicated, right? There's sometimes people will say, oh my gosh, like when they're out of town, I'm so much happier. So you're alone, they're on a business trip, you're telling me you're happier. So there's small A alone and there's big A alone, right? Small A alone is they're out of town for 3 days and I get to have the dog in the bed with me. Big A alone is you're single and you don't have your person. That's what I want to understand the meaning of. Because you're saying you love when they're gone, but there's a bigger existential issue of what it means. And I think one thing I'm happy about in the world is we're no longer fetishizing people being in relationships like, ooh, your life's going to be so much better. I just read an interesting article in The Atlantic that said People who are married are generally happier, which I found fascinating. I would say probably people who are happily married are generally happier. We've got to create a world where people feel whole within themselves, and then and the enhancement in their life is their relationship. But I think that from a pretty early age, we sell people a bill of goods of love stories and pairing off and dyads. We are, though, now millennials and the generation of the Gen X's, we're now going to start seeing generations where probably the rate of non-marriage might be equal or higher than marriage. So I think that that's, to me, strangely enough, I'm going to say that's promising. I don't think it's that young people and people coming into adulthood aren't going to get into relationships. They're going to be playing by a different set of rules and fluidity. But I think above all else, teaching people how to be comfortable with their own company. They may say, listen, I love being at a party. I love other people. Great. But to enjoy your solitude as much as you enjoy being with other people, but never feeling that you have to sell your soul to avoid being alone. That's the piece that we're trying to avoid. So helping people cultivate that sense of being alone and loving it.
If you enjoyed that, then make sure that you click right here, right now, so that you can enjoy the full episode.
Now, here's where you gotta be careful though, Lisa, right? Narcissistic people, for their lack of empathy, lack of self-awareness, lack of regard for others, have an uncanny ability